Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. We often talk about the challenges facing education, and today we're zeroing in on something that's at the heart of it all: teacher stress. It's not just about tough days in the classroom, it really impacts everything.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It ripples outwards. And to really get into the nitty-gritty of this, we're diving into a specific research paper. It's a 2016 paper by Christopher J. McCarthy and his colleagues titled Assessing Teacher Appraisals and Stress in the Classroom. Review of the Classroom Appraisal of Resources and Demands.
Okay, right off the bat, that title brings up a word that I think is really key here: appraisals. Because when we think about what makes teaching so demanding, we often picture, overflowing classrooms, stacks of papers to grade, and that's all real. But this research suggests there's something deeper going on, right? It's about how teachers are experiencing those things.
It is. It's about their perspective. This paper actually makes a really important shift. It moves away from solely focusing on those external pressures and really zooms in on the individual teacher's internal evaluation, how they're processing and making sense of their day-to-day experiences. And the core of this understanding is the classroom appraisal of resources and demands model.
The card.
Exactly the card.
So let's break that down a bit. For our listeners, what is this card model actually looking at?
Well, think of it this way. The card model is designed to measure how teachers are weighing the demands they face in their classrooms against the resources they feel they have to meet those demands. So on the demand side, you've got things like student behavior, administrative workload, even just having the right teaching materials.
Mm.
And then on the resources side, we're talking about support from their principal, help from other adults in the classroom, maybe classroom aides, the quality of the curriculum provided, all of that.
So it's about the teacher's personal sense of, can I handle this with what I've got? That's what the card art is trying to capture.
Precisely. It's that feeling, that sense of being equipped or not equipped to deal with what's in front of you. And that's where this deep dive is taking us today. We're trying to understand how these individual teacher appraisals impact their overall well-being, how satisfied they are with their work, and ultimately, whether they even stay in the profession. It offers a really powerful way to look at the challenges in education and maybe even think about some new solutions.
This idea that it's not just about what's happening, but about how we interpret it, that feels incredibly relevant, not just to teaching, but to so many aspects of life. And this paper, it builds on some older ideas about stress, right?
It does. The authors point back to the work of Kirikou and Sutcliffe, all the way back from 1977. And they define teacher stress as a negative emotional response that comes up when a teacher feels like they just don't have what it takes to meet the demands of the job.
So essentially, two teachers could be in the same school, same grade level, facing the same objective challenges, same number of students, same curriculum, but one might feel completely on top of it while the other feels totally overwhelmed.
Exactly. And while a lot of the past research, understandably focuses on those external visible factors, things like class size, paperwork load, referencing work by people like Boyd, French, Moriarty, this paper is making a case that we need to really hone in on what's happening inside the teacher's head. What's their individual appraisal of the situation?
Because just counting the number of desks in a classroom doesn't actually tell you how manageable that classroom feels to the person who's actually leading it. You could have a smaller class with really complex needs that feels much more demanding than a larger class that's pretty independent.
Right, absolutely. And the theoretical foundation for this approach, this focus on appraisal, actually comes from Lazarus and Folkman's transactional model of stress from 1984. And this model emphasizes that stress isn't just something that happens to us. It's this constant interaction between the person and their environment. It arises when an individual perceives that the demands are outweighing the resources that they have to cope. It's that perceived gap that's causing the stress response.
So it's not just the weight of the demands, it's about whether you feel strong enough, equipped enough to actually carry that weight.
That's it. But as Hoppel pointed out in 1989, a major hurdle with these transactional models has been figuring out how to measure this perceived balance in a really meaningful way. How do you compare, apples and oranges? How do you quantify the stress of a kid acting out versus, feeling like your principal just doesn't get it? There's no standard unit of stress.
Exactly. And I think that's where the cardboard model comes in. It's trying to bridge that gap.
It is. It's an attempt to bridge that measurement gap by directly asking teachers to appraise both the demands and the resources that they have available. And the paper actually points out that outside of the research that uses the card model, There haven't really been many other efforts to directly compare these two things in the way that Hobfull suggested we should.
So the car is really getting at the very personal experience of what it feels like to be a teacher in that specific classroom. And the paper mentions that teachers are making two main types of appraisals.
Yes, exactly. First, you've got primary appraisal. That's where the teacher's figuring out, okay, what are the demands that I'm facing and just how severe are these? How challenging do these feel to me? And then there's secondary appraisal, which is where the teacher takes stock of, all right, what resources do I have available? And how helpful are these resources in actually addressing those demands? And then those two appraisals interact, and they're ultimately shaping the teacher's overall stress response. It determines whether they're seeing the situation as a threat, something that could cause them harm or damage, or as a challenge that they can actually overcome.
So harm versus challenge, it's not just that there are difficult things happening, it's about whether you feel equipped to deal with them.
Precisely. It hinges
Yeah.
on that fundamental sense of being able to cope.
Okay, let's actually get into the nuts and bolts of the card itself. What does it look like? What does it ask teachers?
Well, the card, it's built around two core sections, mirroring those primary and secondary appraisals. One section focuses on demands, and the other focuses on resources.
Makes sense. So let's start with the demands. What kind of things are we talking about?
Okay, so the demand scale, it actually includes 35 specific items. And teachers rate each item based on how demanding it feels to them on a 5-point scale. It ranges from not demanding at all to extremely demanding. And these items, they're grouped into a few key areas. One big one is students with problematic behaviors. So, dealing with kids who are constantly disruptive, for example.
Yeah, you can imagine how draining that would be on a teacher's time, their energy, their focus.
It's huge. And another category is about other student-related demands. So dealing with, kids who have really inconsistent attendance or who have really significant learning differences. And then you've got the administrative demands, which might include the sheer number of meetings or the piles of paperwork. And then finally, it looks at the lack of essential teaching resources, like not having access to basic classroom supplies, for example.
Wow. So it really tries to capture just how multifaceted the demands on teachers are. It's not just one thing.
Not at all, no.
What about the flip side? The resources.
Okay, so the resources scale, that one has 30 items. And teachers rate how helpful they find different resources that the school provides, again, on a 5-point scale, from very unhelpful to very helpful. So one category is the support that they get from, school personnel, particularly administrators at their school site.
I would imagine that relationship between a teacher and their principal, that's got to be key to feeling supported.
Research definitely suggests that. The scale also looks at the helpfulness of other adults who might be present in the classroom, like teacher aides or parent volunteers. And then it assesses the instructional support, so things like textbooks, curriculum materials, how helpful those are. And finally, it looks at the availability of specialized resources, like things specifically designed for students who might be working below grade level or who have special needs.
So it's not just about whether the resources technically exist, it's about whether teachers find them actually useful.
Exactly. And the paper references a study by Lambert and colleagues from 2009 that really dug into the card and confirmed this nice, clean two-factor structure, the demand scale and the resources scale. It also showed that the card is a reliable, consistent measure.
Okay, so we have these two scores. What happens next? What's the magic?
The key is how those scores are used. From those two scales, they calculate something called the appraisal index. And this is really just your demand score minus your resources score. And this index gives us a picture of the overall balance, or as is often the case, the imbalance between what a teacher feels is being asked of them and what they feel they have to work with.
So if you have a really high positive number on that index, that suggests a huge gap, right?
Right. It means the demands are way up here and the resources are way down here.
The big mismatch.
Exactly. And the authors, they're really upfront about some of the statistical issues that can happen with different scores, but they also highlight the steps they took when they were developing the card to make sure that this appraisal index is actually reliable and valid.
And then based on this index, teachers are put into different groups.
Yes. So if your resources score is much higher than your demand score, you're classified as resourced. Makes sense. If your demands and resources scores are pretty similar, you're in the balanced group. And then if your demand score is a lot higher than your resources score, you're classified as the demands group. And the prediction is that this demands group, they're the ones who are most at risk for experiencing stress and all of the negative stuff that can come with it.
That makes sense. If you constantly feel like you're running on fumes, you're going to burn out. And it's interesting that the paper also points out that even within the same school, different teachers' scores on the card can vary a lot. They reference studies by O'Donnell and McCarthy on this.
Yeah, you can't just assume that everyone working in the same building is having the same experience. What's happening inside their heads matters. And it's also worth noting that there are versions of the card that have been created for other school roles, like for school counselors, principals even. And it's been translated into different languages, which shows that this way of thinking about stress, it has broad relevance.
Okay, so we have this tool, the card. We can see how teachers are perceiving their world. What are some of the big takeaways? What have we learned from the research that's been done using the card? Let's start with something basic. Job satisfaction.
Well, the findings are pretty consistent across lots of different studies. Teachers who fall into that demands group, the ones who are feeling that big imbalance between demands and resources, they report much lower levels of job satisfaction. And the paper actually cites a number of studies in their Table 1 that show this connection.
Which makes sense. If you feel constantly overwhelmed, like you're drowning, you're not going to love your job. And they actually provide a formal definition of job satisfaction, right?
They do. They draw on Locke's 1976 definition, which says that job satisfaction is a pleasurable or positive emotional state resulting from the appraisal of one's job or job experiences. So there's that word again, appraisal. It highlights how important our own perception is to how we feel about our work.
And this lack of job satisfaction, unfortunately, we can't just talk about it in a vacuum. It's linked to something that's a huge problem in education, teachers leaving the profession.
Absolutely. And the paper highlights, the really high rates of teacher turnover that we've been seeing in the U.S. for years. And when you look at studies that have used the card, especially ones that used a measure called plans to leave current job, teachers in that demands group, they're much more likely to say that they're thinking about leaving.
Right.
Again, Table 1 in the paper lays this out really clearly.
So it's not just that teachers are unhappy, it's that this mismatch between demands and resources, it's actually pushing them out the door. And that has huge implications, right?
It really does. The paper also points to findings from a really big national survey called the Schools and Staffing Survey. And basically, teachers who fit the resource profile from the card studies were much more likely to say, yeah, I'd want to teach again, and yeah, I'd come back to this next year, compared to those who looked more like the demands group. This suggests that these findings from the card studies aren't just a fluke.
It's a pattern.
Yeah, a real pattern.
Okay, let's talk about something else that's really closely tied to stress. Burnout.
Yeah, burnout is a big one. And the paper defines it as, this prolonged response to chronic stressors on the job, citing folks like Carson and Ciofeli, who are really big in the burnout world. And teaching is often cited as one of the professions that's most susceptible to burnout, for obvious reasons.
And burnout, it's more than just being tired after a long week. There are specific things that characterize burnout.
Exactly. There are 3 core dimensions of burnout, and these were originally described by Maslow and her colleagues. First, there's emotional exhaustion, just feeling completely drained and depleted. Second, there's depersonalization. This is where you start to develop a more cynical, detached attitude toward the students, toward your work. And then the third dimension is this reduced sense of personal accomplishment. You're just not feeling effective. It's like, is anything I'm doing even making a difference? And the standard way to measure burnout is through something called the Maslow Burnout Inventory, or the MBI, which the paper mentions.
So how does the card research tie into burnout?
The findings here are also really consistent. Studies using the card have found significant links between a teacher's appraisal, specific, high demand score and low resources score, and higher levels of burnout across all 3 of those dimensions. There's work by Ulrich and McCarthy that really highlights these connections.
And it's interesting that the paper makes this point, that it seems to be the teacher's perception of their resources and demands, more than the objective conditions of the school itself, that really predicts burnout.
Yeah, it's huge. It means that even in the same school, with the same principal, the same resources available in the building, 2 teachers can have very different burnout levels depending on how they're seeing things.
That's a really important takeaway for anyone who's thinking about how to address teacher burnout. You can't just focus on the environment. You have to focus on what's happening in people's heads. The paper also talks about, the idea of resources that teachers might have for preventing or coping with stress.
Yes. They bring up this concept of coping resources, building on the work of Matheny and others, and they mention a tool called the Preventive Resources Inventory, or the PRI. And the idea here is that if a teacher has a really strong set of personal and professional resources for managing stress, they might be less likely to feel like their classroom is this totally overwhelming, stressful place.
Makes sense. So do the Cardite findings back this up?
They do. Studies by McCarthy and his colleagues have actually found negative associations between scores on the appraisal index, remember that's the demands minus resources score, and scores on the PRI. So teachers who are saying that their demands are much higher than their resources, they also tend to report that they have fewer of these stress prevention resources.
Which can create a vicious cycle. If you're already feeling overwhelmed, you're also less likely to feel like you can do anything about it, which makes it even worse.
It does. It becomes harder and harder to get out of that hole.
The paper also gets into some of the more concrete things that might be contributing to these demands, things like dealing with kids with really challenging needs and the impact of class size.
Right. So the research suggests that the demands group, the teachers who are feeling that high demand, low resource mismatch, they tend to report having more students with behavioral problems and learning disabilities in their classrooms. And there's work by Feng, Ingersoll, and May that supports this connection.
Which makes sense. Those kinds of needs often require so much extra time and energy from teachers, and they often require specialized resources that maybe aren't readily available.
Yeah, and the paper also points out that larger class sizes are more likely to be reported by teachers in the demands group. And they reference some studies by folks like Schanzenbach, Griffith, Jin, who have looked at this. Larger classes just amplify the impact of everything else. They stretch resources even thinner.
It's like trying to cook dinner for 4 people versus cooking dinner for 20 people. It's the same basic task, but the scale changes everything.
Absolutely. And the demands increase exponentially. Then the paper moves on to talk about a meta-analysis of all the research that's been done using the card. Just for our listeners who might not be familiar with this term, a meta-analysis basically combines the results of many different studies on the same topic, so you get this bigger, more powerful overview. So what did they find?
Yeah, what did this bigger picture look like?
Well, this meta-analysis looked at 18 different studies. First of all, it confirmed that both the demands and resources scales of the card and the appraisal index itself, they're all really reliable. So that gives us more confidence that this tool is actually measuring what it's supposed to measure.
That's important. We need to know the tool is solid.
Definitely. And when they looked at the differences between the demands and resource groups across all those different studies, they found some pretty striking patterns. For example, the demands group, compared to the resource group, had much higher levels of burnout.
Not surprising, but still important to see that pattern so clearly.
It is. They also reported fewer of those preventative coping resources, more students with challenging needs in their classes, and much higher intentions to leave teaching.
Wow, that paints a pretty stark picture.
Yeah. And on the flip side, they had much lower levels of job satisfaction.
All of that together is pretty alarming, and the paper talks about effect sizes, which I think is a helpful concept here, because it tells us how big these differences actually are.
Exactly. And the effect sizes in this meta-analysis were pretty substantial.
Yeah.
We're not talking about tiny little differences that could just be due to chance. These are meaningful differences. The meta-analysis also found some interesting correlations. There was a moderate positive correlation between the demand score, the appraisal index, and burnout. And then a moderate negative correlation between the appraisal index and job satisfaction.
So the more those demands outweigh the resources, the more likely you are to be burned out and dissatisfied. Makes sense. So what are the big takeaways from all this research? What should we be doing differently?
Well, the paper makes a really strong case that we have to understand these individual teacher perceptions if we want to actually support teachers effectively. We can't just rely on these broad school-wide initiatives. We have to recognize that different teachers in the same school can be having really different experiences.
So a one-size-fits-all approach probably isn't going to cut it.
It won't. And the paper suggests that using tools like the card early on could help identify those teachers who are most at risk, the ones who are really struggling.
So being more proactive.
Right. And then we can tailor the support that we provide based on what their needs actually are.
So if a teacher's appraisal says, hey, I don't have the resources I need to teach these kids, then we need to make sure they get those resources.
Exactly. And the paper also talks about how important it is to distribute students with special needs and behavioral challenges fairly across classrooms. So we don't have certain teachers who are just constantly bombarded with the toughest cases, while other teachers have a much easier time.
It's about being more intentional with those assignments and being aware of the impact they can have.
Absolutely. And the paper even suggests that maybe teacher training programs should be doing more to help prepare new teachers for these realities. Teach them strategies for coping with stress, building resilience, managing challenging behavior.
I think that's huge. You can know all the theory in the world about how to teach, but if you don't know how to deal with the day-to-day emotional grind, if you don't know how to handle a kid who's having a meltdown, that theory is not going to get you very far.
Exactly. It's a whole other skill set. And it's so fascinating that the paper even cites an observational study that found differences in the way that teachers from different appraisal groups interacted with their students.
Really?
Yeah, so how you're feeling, whether you feel resourced or totally depleted, that can actually change how you're behaving in the classroom.
Which, of course, then impacts the students. That all comes back around.
Okay.
So to sum it all up, what's the big message you want our listeners to walk away with today?
Teacher stress isn't just about the job itself. It's about how teachers perceive the balance between what they're being asked to do and what they have to work with. And that perception, it matters. It affects their well-being, whether they stay in the profession, and ultimately it impacts kids.
And the card model gives us this really valuable way to understand those perceptions.
It does. It helps us move beyond these assumptions and really see what's happening for individual teachers.
So here's something for everyone listening to think about. What can we do at the school level, at the district level, even at the policy level to better support teachers? How can we create environments that feel balanced, that feel sustainable? We could rethink how we assign students, how we train teachers, how we structure the school day even. It's a big challenge, but understanding this dynamic of appraisal is a crucial first step. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.